Walter Harlan had trusted First County Bank for 50 years. On that cold Monday morning, at the age of 76, he put on his best brown jacket, the one his wife, Martha, only allowed him to wear to church, funerals, and important business. In the breast pocket of that jacket, folded neatly, was a yellowed piece of paper. On it, written in his own trembling handwriting, was an account number. That number had followed Walter through droughts, failed harvests, Martha's hospital bills, and 50 years of sweat on 120 acres of family land. That morning, for the first time in his life, he had come to withdraw the money he had spent decades saving. The young teller smiled when he stepped up to the counter. "Good morning, sir. How can I help you?" Walter placed the piece of paper on the counter and smoothed it flat with two calloused fingers. "I'd like to close my savings account." The young woman typed his name into the computer. Then she typed it again. Then she asked for his social security number. Walter gave it to her. Then she asked for the old farm address. Walter gave her that too. Then she entered the number written on the yellow paper. The smile disappeared from her face. "Let me try one more time, sir." Walter stood still, holding his hat in both hands, watching her with the patience of a man who had spent his life waiting for rain, waiting for crops, waiting for the world to take its time. A few minutes later, the teller stood up and walked toward the glass office at the end of the lobby. That office belonged to Charles Whitmore, the branch manager, a man who had been at First County Bank so long that almost nobody in Mill Creek could remember the bank without him. When Charles walked out, Walter recognized him immediately. His hair was thinner now. His face was sharper. His suit looked more expensive than anything Walter had ever owned, but Walter still remembered him. This was the same young bank employee, only 22 years old back then, ambitious and eager to prove himself, who had opened Walter's savings account in 1974. Walter breathed out in relief. "Charlie," he said softly, "you'll remember this. You opened it for me after my father passed." Charles looked down at the paper. For half a second, something flashed across his eyes. Then he smiled. Not a warm smile, a contemptuous one. The smile of a man who believed he held all the power in the room. "Mr. Harlan," Charles said, deliberately loud enough for the two people standing behind Walter to hear, "there is no account." Walter blinked. "That can't be." Charles pushed the paper back across the counter with one finger. "There never was." Walter looked at the young teller, then back at Charles. "I've been putting money into that account for 50 years. Charles leaned back, as if he were explaining something simple to a child. "People your age can remember a lot of things wrong." The entire bank lobby went silent. The farmer near the deposit table lowered his newspaper. The woman writing a check stopped moving her pen. The security guard by the door glanced over. Behind the counter, near the coffee machine, a young assistant manager named Rebecca Lane stood frozen. She had worked at that bank for 9 years. She had grown used to seeing older customers treated as if their time no longer mattered. But that morning, watching Walter Harlan being spoken to that way, something tightened in her chest. She said nothing. Not yet. Walter felt heat rising behind his ears. But he did not shout. He did not curse. He did not pound the counter. He only said, "Check the old records." Charles's smirk disappeared. "There are no old records to check." Walter looked him straight in the eye. "You opened it for me." Charles adjusted his tie. "I have opened thousands of accounts in this town. That does not mean I opened yours." Walter's voice dropped. "My money is in this bank." Charles looked around the lobby, then lowered his voice just enough to sound polite, while still being cruel. "Mr. Harlan, old numbers on old paper don't create real money." Walter did not move. Charles sighed, as if Walter were wasting everyone's time. Then he nodded to the security guard, and in front of neighbors who had known him for decades, Walter Harlan was escorted out of the bank like a confused old man causing trouble. Charles Whitmore watched through the glass as Walter stepped onto the sidewalk. Then he turned around and went back to his office. He believed the matter was finished. But Charles had made one mistake. He thought Walter had come alone. He did not know that back at the Harlan farm, inside a dusty metal box beneath the basement stairs, Walter's wife had kept every receipt. For 50 years. Walter's father, Ernest Harlan, died in February of 1974. The funeral was held on a windy Thursday. When the last neighbor left the farm, Walter stood in the kitchen with Martha. He was 26. She was 24. On the table were bills, seed orders, repair invoices, and a mortgage note that still had several years left on it. They were young enough to be afraid, but too proud to show it. 3 days after the funeral, Walter found an envelope inside his father's desk. Inside was a piece of paper written in Ernest's careful hand. "Son, the land will feed you if you don't try to use it to impress people. Put something away after every harvest. A farmer who owes everybody never really stands on his own ground." Walter read that note 3 times. The following week, after selling a small load of corn, he drove into Mill Creek and walked into First County Bank with $312 in cash. The man sitting behind the desk was a young employee named Charles Whitmore. He was 22 years old, only a few months into the job, full of ambition and eager to prove himself. Charles had polished shoes, a fresh haircut, and a kind of confidence Walter did not trust, though he did not yet have a reason to dislike him. "I'd like to open a savings account," Walter said. Charles smiled and pulled out the paperwork. "For farm income?" "For retirement," Walter answered. Charles looked up, amused. "You're a little young to be thinking about retirement." Walter folded his hands. "My father was too." That made Charles stop smiling for a moment. He filled out the forms. Walter signed where he was told. Charles stamped the first deposit slip, wrote the account number on a card, and handed Walter a small passbook. Then he reached across the desk and shook Walter's hand. "This bank will keep it safe," Charles said. Walter believed him. That was the old way. A man's word, a stamp, a receipt, a handshake. For Walter, that was enough. But for Martha, it was not. That evening, when Walter came home, he placed the passbook and the receipt on the kitchen table. Martha picked them up, studied the stamp, checked the date, and asked, "Where are you going to keep these?" Walter shrugged. "In the desk, I suppose." Martha shook her head. "No. Paper has a natural way of disappearing when men think they'll remember where they put it." She found a brown envelope, wrote 1974, savings on the front, and placed the receipt inside. Walter smiled. "You planning to keep every scrap of paper I bring home?" Martha looked at him over her glasses. "If it has a $sign or a signature on it, yes." That was Martha. Walter worked the land. Martha protected the proof. Neither of them knew that her habit would one day save everything. The account grew the way a farm grows. Slowly, unevenly. One season at a time. There were good years, when the corn stood tall, the soybeans filled out heavy, and the prices at the grain elevator gave every farmer in Mill Creek a reason to smile. There were terrible years, too. In 1980, hail tore through 40 acres in less than 12 minutes. Walter deposited only $60 that fall. In 1983, interest rates crushed half the county. Men who had bought new machinery with borrowed money started hiding it behind barns so the neighbors would not see the bank tags. Walter kept repairing old equipment and deposited $110. One year, just before Christmas, Walter deposited $200. Martha had wanted to use it to buy presents for the children, but she did not say so. She only put the receipt into the envelope and wrote, "Christmas 1985. Walter deposited." In 1988, the drought came so hard that the creek behind the house cracked into plates of dry mud. Walter sold fewer bushels than almost any year he could remember, but he still deposited $40, because his father had said every harvest, not just the easy ones. Every time Walter came home from the bank, Martha took the receipt. She had a system. Each year had its own envelope. On every envelope, the year was written in black ink. Inside were deposit slips, interest notices, account updates, and sometimes small notes Martha wrote to herself. Walter deposited after corn sale, bank computer down, handwritten receipt. Charles signed this one. New account format after system change. Sometimes Walter teased her. "Martha, you keep paper like a banker keeps secrets." And she would answer, "That's because paper tells the truth when people forget how." In the 1990s, the bank changed. The old wooden counters were replaced. The brass rails came down. Computers appeared. The passbook savings system was replaced with printed statements. Walter did not like it, but he still trusted the bank. One day in 1991, the teller told him the bank was migrating old accounts into the new computer system. Walter did not understand what migrating meant. "It just means we're updating the records," she explained. Your account will stay the same. That day, the computer was down, so a manager had to come out and approve the transaction manually. It was Charles Whitmore. By then, Charles was no longer the young man behind the desk. He was an assistant manager, with a better office and a sharper way of speaking. He looked at Walter's passbook, checked the account number, and wrote a note on the receipt. Manual migration confirmed. Then he signed his initials, CW. That evening, Martha noticed it. "What does this mean?" she asked. Walter shrugged. "Something about their new system." Martha studied the initials. "Charles Whitmore signed this." "Looks like it." Martha placed the receipt into the 1991 envelope and underlined the year twice. She did not know why. She only knew that a handwritten note from a bank manager mattered. The years went on. Walter and Martha raised children, buried friends, repaired the roof, replaced fences, paid taxes, and kept farming. The account was never touched. It was not for vacations. It was not for a new truck. It was not for showing off. It was for the day Walter could no longer climb onto a tractor before sunrise. By 2024, that day had come. Walter's knees hurt in the winter. His hands cramped when he held a wrench too long. Martha's medical bills were getting heavier. The farmhouse roof leaked. The land taxes were due again. One Sunday evening, Walter sat at the kitchen table with his father's note beside him. "I think it's time," he said. Martha understood immediately. "The savings?" Walter nodded. "I don't need to die with money, sitting in a bank, while the roof leaks over your head." Martha took his hand. "Then we'll go get it." Walter smiled. "No need for both of us to go. I'll take care of it Monday." Martha almost argued, but then she let him go. It was a decision she would regret for exactly 6 hours. When Walter came home that Monday morning, Martha knew something was wrong before he even opened the truck door. He sat in the driveway for nearly 2 minutes. That was not like Walter. Walter was a man who parked, stepped out, and went straight to whatever needed doing. A fence post, a broken latch, a water pipe, a stuck calf. But that morning, he just sat there with both hands gripping the steering wheel. Martha watched from the kitchen window. Finally, he got out. His hat was in his hand. His shoulders looked lower than they had when he left. When he entered the kitchen, Martha already had coffee waiting. Walter did not touch it. He sat down slowly. "What happened?" she asked. Walter looked at the tabletop. "They said there is no account." Martha frowned. "What do you mean there is no account?" Walter swallowed. "Charles said it never existed." For a long moment, Martha did not move. She knew that name. She knew that signature. And she knew that kind of contempt, even though she had not seen the smirk herself that morning. Walter told her everything. The young teller, the computer search, Charles walking out, the way he said there was no account, the way he said old people remembered things wrong, the way the whole lobby went silent, the way the security guard took him by the elbow. Walter's voice did not break until the last sentence. "He made me look like I was begging for money that wasn't mine." Then he went quiet, and in the next terrible moment, another thought slipped into his mind, one even more painful than the humiliation. What if Charles was right? What if he had remembered wrong all these years? What if old age really was stealing pieces of his memory? Walter closed his eyes. But when he opened them again, Martha had already stood up. She did not cry. She did not curse. She did not say, "I told you so." She walked to the basement door, turned on the light, and went down the wooden steps. Walter heard cardboard boxes moving, then the scrape of metal, then a long silence. In the dim basement light, Martha stood still, with one hand resting on the cold lid of a metal box. She did not open it right away. She closed her eyes. "Ernest," she whispered, speaking to her late father-in-law, "you told me to keep things safe. I kept them." Then she opened her eyes, picked up the box, and carried it upstairs. She set it on the kitchen table. Walter stared at it. "What is that?" Martha wiped the dust from the lid with a cloth. "Our memory." She opened it. Inside were envelopes. Dozens of them. Walter leaned forward. Every envelope had a year written on it. 1974, 1975, 1976, all the way to 2024. Martha pulled out the first envelope and handed it to him. Walter opened it with hands that had suddenly begun to tremble. Inside was the first deposit receipt. $312. First County Bank. Stamped. Dated. Signed by Charles Whitmore. Walter stared at the paper for a long time. Then Martha opened the 1991 envelope. She pulled out the receipt with the handwritten note. Manual migration confirmed. C.W. Walter's eyes blurred, but no tears fell. Not yet. Martha placed her hand over his. They can say a computer forgot you, she said, but they cannot say the paper never knew you. Walter did not want to sue anyone. That was the truth. He had spent his whole life avoiding lawyers, courts, and arguments that lasted longer than a handshake. But by Tuesday morning he understood one thing. Charles had not made a mistake. A mistake sounded confused. Charles had sounded prepared. Martha called Ellen Price. Ellen had grown up 2 fields over from the Harlan farm. Her father had once borrowed Walter's hay roller after a storm. She had left Mill Creek to study law, returned 20 years later, and opened a small office above the pharmacy. She specialized in estate records, farm disputes, land ownership, and financial claims. When she arrived at the Harlan kitchen, she expected to see a few old receipts. Then Martha opened the metal box. Ellen stopped talking. For the next 3 hours, she examined each piece of paper. She did not rush. She checked dates. She checked stamps. She checked account numbers. She checked teller initials. She sorted the receipts into piles by decade. The 1970s, the 1980s, the 1990s, the 2000s, the 2010s, the 2020s. Then she found the 1991 receipt. She held it under the light. "Walter," she said quietly, "did Charles Whitmore write this?" Walter leaned closer. "I believe so." Ellen's expression changed. It was not excitement. It was something colder. Focus. "This is important." Martha sat up straighter. "Because it proves he knew about the account." Ellen nodded. "It proves more than that. It shows the account was part of a manual migration process. That means if the bank says the account never existed, we don't just ask for account records. We ask for migration logs, batch reports, teller settlement records, dormant account lists, internal reconciliation accounts." Walter did not understand all the words, but he understood Ellen's tone. She had found a thread, and she intended to pull it until something came loose. Before leaving, Ellen placed the 1991 receipt into a protective plastic sleeve. Then she looked at Walter. "Did you ever withdraw money from this account?" "No. Never. Not once." "Did you ever sign anything closing it?" "No." "Did the bank ever send a notice saying it was inactive, abandoned, transferred or closed?" Martha answered before Walter could speak. "If they did, it would be in that box." Ellen looked at the envelopes again. For the first time that day, she smiled. "Then Charles Whitmore has a problem." Ellen sent an official letter to the bank on Wednesday morning. It was polite, professional, and sharp enough to cut. She requested every record connected to Walter Harlan's savings account, including historical ledgers, passbook records, migration documents, teller transaction logs, internal transfer records, dormant account reports, and any document bearing the account number listed on Walter's receipts. The bank responded 6 days later. The letter was signed by a regional compliance officer, but Ellen could see Charles's fingerprints on every line. The bank denied that any active or historical account existed under the name Walter Harlan. It claimed its systems had gone through multiple upgrades over the decades. It claimed older paper records may have been destroyed under standard retention policies. It claimed the receipts Walter provided were not enough to prove any current balance. Then came the sentence that made Ellen sit upright in her chair. "It is possible Mr. Harlan previously withdrew or closed any such account, if it existed." If it existed. Ellen read those 3 words again and again. The bank was trying to stand in 2 places at once. First it said the account never existed. Then it suggested Walter might have closed it. But a man cannot close an account that never existed. Ellen drove to the Harlan farm that afternoon. She read the letter aloud at the kitchen table. Walter listened with his hands folded. Martha's face hardened. "They are calling him a liar twice," she said. Ellen nodded. "Yes." Walter looked out the window toward the machine shed. "What happens now?" Ellen placed the bank's letter beside the 1991 receipt. "Now we stop asking politely." By the end of the 2nd week, all of Mill Creek knew something had happened. Small towns do not need newspapers to spread news. They have coffee counters. They have church parking lots. They have lines of trucks at the grain elevator, where men sit with their windows rolled down and talk. The first version was simple. Walter Harlan had gone to the bank and caused trouble. The second version was uglier. Walter was confused and thought he had money that was not there. That version came from someone inside the bank. No one could prove it, but everyone knew. At the feed store, a man named Roy Blevins shook his head and said, "Walter's getting old. Happens to everybody eventually." Another farmer, Dale Mercer, frowned. "Walter Harlan may be old, but I've never known him to lie about $1. The story quietly divided people. Some believed the bank. Some believed Walter. Most simply waited. Walter hated that part most. He could stand losing money. He could stand drought. He could stand machinery breaking down in the middle of harvest. But he could not stand being treated like a man whose word no longer carried any weight. One morning, he walked into the co-op and heard two men stop talking when they saw him. He bought hydraulic oil, paid cash, and left without saying a word. At home, Martha found him sitting in the machine shed on an upside-down bucket beside his old farmall. "You all right?" she asked. Walter rubbed his hands together. "He didn't just take the account," he said. "He took my name." Martha stood beside him. "No, he only borrowed it, and now we're going to take it back." Ellen filed a petition in county court asking a judge to force the bank to produce records. The bank's lawyer tried to make the matter sound small. An old man, some old receipts, no digital account, a misunderstanding. But Ellen did not argue with emotion. She argued with paper. She presented sample receipts from 5 different decades. The same account number appeared again and again. Official bank stamps, teller batch codes, deposit dates that matched harvest seasons. Then she presented the 1991 receipt. Manual migration confirmed. CW. The judge leaned forward. "Who is CW?" Ellen answered, "Charles Whitmore, the current branch manager." The bank's lawyer stood. "Your Honor, initials on an old receipt do not establish." The judge raised one hand. "They establish enough to open discovery." That sentence changed everything. The court ordered the bank to produce any remaining paper documents, microfilm, migration records, internal accounting logs, and transaction histories linked to the account number on Walter's receipts. The bank had 30 days. The next morning, Charles Whitmore spent hours in his office with the door closed. Employees heard him make 3 phone calls. On the 4th call, his voice rose. "No," he snapped. "You don't understand. Those records were supposed to be gone." Rebecca Lane, the young assistant manager who had watched Walter get escorted out, happened to walk past the office at that moment. She stopped. Then she kept walking. But she remembered every word. The bank produced boxes of records on the 29th day, not because it wanted to, because the judge had ordered it. At first glance, most of the documents looked useless. Printouts, old policy manuals, microfilm copies, ledger fragments, internal reports with codes that meant nothing to Walter. The bank's lawyer looked confident. "There is no direct account record," he said. "This confirms our position." Ellen did not answer immediately. She hired a forensic accountant named Samuel Reed. Samuel was 63, retired from federal financial investigations, and had the patient eyes of a man who knew numbers did not disappear just because people wanted them to. He met Walter and Martha at Ellen's office. Walter handed him the box of receipts. Samuel lifted the first envelope, then looked at Martha. "You kept them by year?" "Yes." "In order?" "Yes." "All of them?" Martha nodded. Samuel smiled. "Mrs. Harlan, you just made my job possible." Walter asked, "Can you find the account?" Samuel shook his head. "I won't start by looking for the account, because if someone hid it, the name may be gone, the customer record may be gone, but money is not. Every deposit receipt leaves footprints in the system, like tire tracks in wet soil. And your footprints are still there." Martha leaned forward. "So you follow the money?" Samuel nodded. "Always." For 2 weeks, Samuel worked through the records. He matched Walter's receipts to teller batch reports, cash settlement logs, and branch totals. One by one, the receipts stopped being old paper. They became coordinates, dates, amounts, codes, evidence. Then Samuel found something strange. Many of Walter's deposits had not gone into a customer savings account after the early 1990s. They had gone into an internal account labeled Legacy Reconciliation Reserve. Samuel printed the page and circled the name. Then he called Ellen. "I found where the money went." The Legacy Reconciliation Reserve had been created during the bank's computer conversion in 1991. At first glance, it looked harmless. Banks sometimes use temporary internal accounts when moving old records into new systems. If an old passbook account had missing data, unclear interest calculations, or a mismatch between paper and computer records, money might temporarily sit in a reconciliation account until staff corrected the problem. Temporarily. That was the key word. Walter's money had not stayed there temporarily. Some deposits sat there for years. Some were moved. Some were combined with other old manual accounts. Some interest adjustments were calculated, then reversed. Samuel found initials beside several entries, C.W. Charles Whitmore. But this was not a theft planned from the beginning. The Legacy Reconciliation Reserve had not been created to steal. It had been created to clean things up. But as each year passed, the accounts that were not claimed became easier to ignore. And every year, Charles told himself that if the account owners did not remember, then the bank did not need to remember either. One small lie fed the next. The pattern was careful, not clumsy. That made it worse. This was not a teller's mistake on a busy morning. This was a system Charles understood. Old farmers with passbooks, widows with savings ledgers, retired laborers who trusted paper. Accounts opened before computers and rarely checked because their owners believed the bank was keeping them safe. Ellen realized the case was no longer only about Walter. She requested expanded discovery. The bank fought hard, too hard. That told Ellen she was getting close. At the next hearing, the bank's lawyer argued that Walter's case was not enough to justify a broader investigation. Ellen stood and placed 3 documents on the table. First, Walter's 1991 receipt. Second, the internal Legacy Reconciliation Reserve entry from the same date. Third, Charles Whitmore's initials on both. "Your Honor," Ellen said, "the bank told my client that his account never existed. We now have evidence that his deposits entered the bank, were manually migrated, and were routed through an internal reserve controlled or approved by the same man who humiliated him in the lobby." The judge looked at the bank's lawyer. "Counsel?" The lawyer could not answer right away. For the first time, no one spoke. Walter looked down at his hands. Martha looked at Charles Whitmore, seated 2 rows behind the bank's lawyer. Charles was no longer smirking, but the worst was still ahead of him. Charles Whitmore was called for deposition on a rainy Thursday. He arrived in a dark suit, carrying a leather briefcase, with the bank's lawyer beside him. He looked calm. At first, Ellen began with easy questions. His name, his position, his years at the bank, his role in the 1991 system migration. Charles answered carefully. "I was one of several employees involved. Did you personally review passbook savings accounts?" "I may have reviewed some." "Did you know Walter Harlan?" Charles paused. "I know many customers." "That was not my question." Charles adjusted his cuff. "Yes, I knew him." "Did you open his savings account in 1974? "I don't recall." Ellen nodded, as if she had expected that answer. She pulled out the original 1974 receipt. "Is this your signature?" Charles looked at it. "It appears similar." "Similar?" "It was 50 years ago." Ellen placed another receipt beside it. 1982. Then another. 1987. Then the 1991 receipt. "Manual migration confirmed. C.W. Are those your initials?" Charles's jaw tightened. "They appear to be." "Did you write the words, 'manual migration confirmed'?" "I don't specifically recall." Ellen leaned forward. "Mr. Whitmore, how many employees at First County Bank in 1991 had the initials C.W. and had the authority to confirm manual migration of passbook savings accounts?" The bank's lawyer objected. Ellen waited. Charles did not answer. Walter sat across the room, but this time he did not lower his head. He looked straight at Charles and drew a deep breath, the first breath that had not felt heavy in his chest since that cold Monday morning. Martha watched Charles's hands. They had begun to tremble. Ellen continued. "When Mr. Harlan came into the bank, you told him there was no account." "Correct. I told him there was no account in the system." "That is not what you said." Charles looked up. Ellen read from the sworn statement of the young teller. She stated that you said, "There is no account. There never was." Did you say that? Charles was silent. Ellen pushed the 1991 receipt closer to him. Mr. Whitmore, if there never was an account, what exactly were you confirming in 1991? That was the moment Charles turned pale. Every bit of color drained from his face, because everyone in the room understood. The receipt did not just prove Walter remembered. It proved Charles had lied. The story might have ended there if Charles had admitted the truth. But men who build their lives on being respected often fear shame more than guilt. The bank suspended Charles 2 days after the deposition. Officially, it was pending internal review. In Mill Creek, everyone understood what that meant. But the real damage came from someone no one expected, though maybe they should have. Rebecca Lane had worked at the bank for 9 years. She knew the old storage system in the basement, the one most newer employees never bothered to understand. And as assistant manager, she had access codes to compliance files almost nobody remembered still existed. She had seen Walter escorted out. She had heard Charles shouting on the phone, and now she had seen enough. She met Ellen in the parking lot behind the county library. She brought a folder. Inside were copies of internal emails, old audit notes, and a list of accounts marked Legacy Unresolved. Walter Harlan's account number was on the list. So were 23 others. Ellen stared at the page. Where did you get this? Rebecca swallowed. From archived compliance files. They were supposed to be reviewed years ago. Who was responsible? Rebecca looked down. Mr. Whitmore. The case exploded. What began as one old farmer's missing savings had become a possible pattern of mishandled legacy accounts. Some customers had died. Some had moved away. Some were widows. Some were elderly farmers who had trusted the bank because their fathers had trusted it. The state banking regulator opened an investigation. Regional executives from the bank arrived in Mill Creek in 2 black SUVs and walked into the branch without smiling at anyone. For 50 years, Charles Whitmore had been the man behind the glass office. Now the glass office was empty, and everyone could see it. The final hearing was held at the county courthouse. By then, the story had traveled far beyond Mill Creek. Farmers came from nearby towns. Some came because they knew Walter. Some came because they had old passbooks of their own. Some came because they wanted to see whether a bank could look a man in the eye, deny his life savings, and still walk away clean. Walter did not want a crowd. Martha told him the crowd was not there to watch him suffer. They're here because if they did it to you, they could have done it to them. Walter wore the same brown jacket he had worn to the bank. Martha carried the metal box. When they entered the courtroom, people turned. Not loudly, respectfully. The bank's lawyer argued that while mistakes may have happened, there was no evidence of intentional wrongdoing by the institution. He suggested that old records were incomplete, interest calculations were complicated, and the bank was willing to resolve Walter's individual claim quietly. Quietly. That word made Martha tighten her grip on the handle of the metal box. They had humiliated Walter publicly. Now they wanted to fix it quietly. Ellen stood. She did not raise her voice. She did not dramatize. She simply opened the box. One envelope at a time, she placed 50 years of receipts on the table. 1974, 1975, 1976. The room watched. 1983, 1984, 1985, 1986, 1987, 1988. Then she placed enlarged copies on the screen. Deposit amount, date, bank stamp, telecode, account number. Then the 1991 receipt. Manual migration confirmed. CW. Then the internal legacy reconciliation reserve entry from the same date. Same amount. Same batch. Same initials. Then the list Rebecca had provided. 24 unresolved legacy accounts. Ellen turned to the judge. My client was told his account never existed. He was told that publicly, by the same man whose initials appear on the document confirming its migration. Now the bank asks to resolve this quietly. But the harm was not quiet. The lie was not quiet. And the paper trail is not quiet. Charles sat behind the bank's lawyers. His eyes stayed fixed on the table. Walter looked at him only once. Not with hatred, with disappointment. That was worse. The judge took 3 days to issue a decision. Those 3 days felt longer than planting season. Walter tried to work around the farm, but every job took twice as long. He fixed a gate that did not need fixing. He cleaned tools that were already clean. He stood in the machine shed and stared at things he had known for 40 years. Martha kept busy too, but every evening she checked the phone. On Friday morning, Ellen called. "Come to town." The ruling was read at 11 o'clock. The judge concluded that Walter had presented clear evidence of a valid historical savings account, repeated deposits, and improper handling of those deposits during and after the bank's system migration. The court ordered the bank to reconstruct Walter's account using all available receipt evidence, teller logs, batch reports, and internal ledger entries. The bank was ordered to pay the full principal amount, recalculated interest, additional damages for wrongful denial and public humiliation, attorney fees, and the cost of the forensic accounting investigation. But the ruling did not stop there. The judge referred the matter to the state banking regulator for review of all unresolved legacy accounts connected to the internal reserve. The bank was required to notify customers or heirs who might have been affected. Charles Whitmore's name appeared in the ruling 13 times. When the judge finished reading, the courtroom was as quiet as a church. Charles did not look up. The smirk that had started everything was gone. In its place was the face of a man who had spent years believing paper would disappear. And now the paper had outlived him. The bank tried to send Walter a private apology, a letter, a check, a confidentiality agreement. Ellen read it and laughed once, without humor. "They want you to sign this and never talk about what happened." Walter looked at Martha. Martha looked at the metal box. "No," Walter said. So the bank was forced to do what it had avoided from the beginning. A public statement. It was held at the VFW Hall because the courthouse steps were too icy that week, and because the VFW had enough chairs for half the county. Farmers came in seed caps and work coats. Widows came with old envelopes in their purses. Retired men came with passbooks tied with rubber bands. The bank sent a regional vice president named Alan Mercer. He wore an expensive coat and looked as if he wished he were anywhere else. Charles Whitmore was there too. He sat in the third row, silent, hands folded. Not at the front, not behind a desk, not in control. Walter and Martha sat near the aisle. The metal box rested on Martha's lap. Alan Mercer stood at the podium and read from a prepared statement. He admitted the bank had failed to maintain and honor Walter Harlan's account records. He admitted Walter had been treated improperly. He admitted the bank's internal review had found problems with older passbook and legacy accounts. He apologized to Walter and Martha. Then he turned toward them. "Mr. Harlan, Mrs. Harlan, on behalf of First County Bank, we are sorry." The room was silent. Everyone waited for Walter. He had not planned to speak, but Martha touched his arm. So Walter stood. He walked slowly to the front. He carried no notes. He stood still for a moment, looking down at his hands that had repaired tractors, planted corn, and kept a promise for 50 years. Then he looked up. "I'm not good at speeches," he began. His voice shook a little, but it was clear. "I came here because a promise was made to me in 1974. He looked toward Charles. Charles stared at the floor. Walter continued. "My father told me to put something away after every harvest. I did. My wife kept the proof, and when I asked for what was mine, I was told it had never existed." He paused. "The money mattered, but my name mattered more." No one moved. Walter looked back at Martha. She kept every receipt because she believed paper tells the truth when people forget how. A few people nodded. A few looked down at their own hands. Then Walter said the line people in Mill Creek would repeat for years. A box of old paper beat a bank because paper never learned how to lie. Charles Whitmore resigned 2 weeks later. The official statement said he was stepping down for personal reasons. No one in Mill Creek believed that. The state investigation continued for months. The bank paid settlements to several other families whose old accounts had been mishandled or left unresolved in the legacy reserve. Some cases were small, a few $100s, a forgotten savings account, a widow's Christmas fund, a farm boy's passbook from the 1970s. Other cases were larger. The money mattered to those families, but the truth mattered more. Charles was never again invited to speak at the Chamber of Commerce breakfast. His name was removed from the bank scholarship committee. At church suppers, people were polite but distant. That was the kind of punishment small towns understand. No shouting, No revenge. Just the slow withdrawal of trust. The worst moment for Charles came one Saturday morning at the feed store. Walter was there buying mineral blocks. Charles walked in. The whole store went quiet. For a moment, the two men stood near the counter. Charles looked older than Walter remembered, and smaller. He cleared his throat. Walter. Walter turned. Charles struggled with the words. I should not have said what I said. Walter waited. Charles looked down. I knew there had been an account. I told myself the records were too old, too complicated, that it wasn't my problem anymore. Walter said nothing. Charles continued. I let the system bury what I should have fixed. Year after year, I told myself that if they didn't remember, then I didn't have to remember either. But I did remember. I always remembered. That was the closest thing to a confession Walter ever heard from him. Walter picked up his receipt from the feed store counter. Then he looked at Charles and said, A man can bury a thing. That doesn't mean it's dead. Then he walked outside. No shouting. No victory speech. Just one sentence sharp enough to last. The money came 3 months later. More than Walter expected. Not enough to make him rich. Enough to fix the roof. Enough to pay Martha's medical bills. Enough to repair the old farmhouse and replace the cracked concrete beside the shed. Enough to breathe. That evening, Walter and Martha sat on the porch, watching the sun set behind the cottonwoods. They did not talk about the bank. They did not talk about Charles. They did not talk about money. I'll make apple pie tomorrow, Martha said. Walter nodded. I'll go buy the apples. They sat for a long time after that. Martha's hand rested in Walter's. The metal box was inside the house, locked in a safe, but somehow it felt as if it was sitting between them, not like a burden, but like a silent witness. A reporter from Des Moines called and asked Walter if he felt vindicated. Walter did not like that word. He said, I feel like I got back what was already mine. The reporter asked Martha why she had kept the receipts for all those years. Martha answered, Because men trust handshakes, but women clean out desks after funerals. That quote ran in the Sunday paper. Walter cut it out and placed it into the 2024 envelope. The metal box did not go back under the basement stairs. Walter bought a small fireproof safe and bolted it to the floor inside the bedroom closet. Inside, Martha placed the receipts, the court ruling, the bank's apology, and Ernest Harlan's old note. Put something away after every harvest, not because you are greedy, because one day your hands will not be able to work the way your heart still wants to. That spring, Walter rented most of the land to a young neighbor, but kept 10 acres for himself. He said a man should not quit everything all at once. On the first warm morning of April, he walked out to the machine shed, opened the large sliding door, and looked at the old farmhouse. The tractor needed paint. It leaked a little oil. The seat was cracked. But when Walter turned the key and pulled the choke, the engine coughed, caught, and settled into a rough, steady rhythm. Martha stepped onto the porch with coffee. Walter looked back at her and smiled. Neither of them said anything for a while. Across town, First County Bank had new management, new procedures, and a new sign near every teller window. Please keep your receipts for your records. People in Mill Creek laughed about that sign, not because it was funny, because everyone knew who had paid for the lesson. Years later, when Walter's grandchildren asked about the metal box in the safe, Martha would take out one receipt, the first one from 1974, and place it on the table. She would show them the stamp, the account number, the signature. Then she would say, "This is not just paper." Walter would nod from his chair. "That," he would say, "is a promise with ink on it." Walter's generation believed in handshakes. His grandchildren's generation believed in words printed on screens. But in the small safe under the closet floor, there was proof that some things should never change. And in Mill Creek, Iowa, the story became one of those quiet rural legends people told whenever someone powerful laughed too soon. They would tell about an old farmer who walked into a bank with nothing but a number in his pocket. They would tell about the manager who smirked and said his account had never existed. They would tell about the farmer who went home humiliated. And then they would lower their voices for the best part, because his wife had kept the receipts, all 50 years of them. And when those receipts were finally placed on the table, the man who laughed turned pale.